Hi, this is Michael Greenwood, and I'm happy to be able to talk to you about one of my favorite films, John Carpenter's Escape from LA from 1996, a sequel to his 1981 classic, Escape from New York. I'll have still frames on screen here, as well as a time code to let you know where we are in the film. But if you'd like to watch along with me, go ahead and play the film and restart this video at the 0 mark simultaneously. If you know anything about this film, it's probably the fact that it is one of the most unloved items in all of John Carpenter's filmography. Possibly only Ghosts of Mars is more despised. And that is pretty much the reason why I wanted to discuss it here, because I happen to love both films, and I know a lot of other people do too. The opening credits in the familiar Albertus lettering font, backed by the music score co-written by Carpenter, are just the first of many things I'll point out that mark this as a true Carpenter film and make it very different from a couple of his other projects that don't appear to show much of the director's involvement at all. Before we get going here, I want to mention that the only reason I decided to do this commentary is because there is no official commentary track on the DVDs or Blu-rays of this film. John Carpenter has done commentaries for almost all of his films. The tracks he did alongside actor Kurt Russell are a ton of fun and among my favorite director's commentaries of all time. It's pretty conspicuous that a track like that is missing for this film, and I guess we have to chalk that up to its general lack of esteem and popularity. I'll say right off the bat that I'm not going to persuade you to respect this movie if you're like 99% of all humanity in being satisfied that it's a piece of junk. My only goal here is to place a tiny little weight on the other side of the scale, if I can. One of the subjects I'll get into is the phenomenon of lynch mob mentality in film criticism. I'm sure you know there are many films that were attacked by mainstream critics at the time of their release out of almost a kind of communal bloodlust impulse rather than analytical objectivity. But eventually won over audiences on their own anyway. And Escape from LA is not unequivocally such a film, but it's getting pretty close. As in the original film, Escape from New York, the voice of Kathleen Blanchard returns here as the dispassionate narrator, letting us know that turning New York City into a giant unregulated prison worked so well that they decided to try it in Los Angeles too. Wait a minute, Kathleen Blanchard? Who is that? She has no other credits except for voice work in these two escape films. I always believed that this was really an uncredited Jamie Lee Curtis, and supposedly that's a theory that's been debunked, but I don't know. I'm not fully convinced until Curtis herself says something about it. Carpenter identified three of his films as what he called an apocalypse trilogy: The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and In the Mouth of Madness. But I think the two escape films are just as apocalyptic, as they both end with the hero essentially condemning society to ruin. And this pretty impressive cataclysm we're seeing certainly augments that same theme. Californians often worry aloud about the so-called big one, the massive earthquake that could occur at any moment and sink half the state into the ocean. And Carpenter serves it up for us here. Some pretty good disaster porn coming in the same year as Roland Emmerich's Independence Day, where space aliens nuke the White House. In the context of the movie business of the mid and late 1990s, we can see that Carpenter was being outclassed by summer blockbusters with massive budgets for special effects and top stars. Having said that, this is not a low-budget film by any means, despite its reputation. Escape from New York, Carpenter's masterpiece, in my opinion, was made for $6 million, and just 15 years later, this film's budget was $50 million. By way of comparison, Independence Day cost $75 million. So what happened here? I guess all the money went into these early disaster scenes because one of the things this movie is really known for is its outrageously janky special effects. Really some of the worst CGI ever. Either that or the above-the-line people took all the money. How can New York look so magnificent with such bare bones production values while LA's most famous moments look so laughably cheap? But hey, let's not be so negative so early in the film. I will say more about those effects a little later. We're going to find ourselves in the far off future of 2013. Some of the things Carpenter predicted in this film are pretty ludicrous, like a crypto fascist wacko with weird hair becoming president of the United States and using a militarized police force to sweep up all non white immigrants for mass deportation. Yeah, Carpenter must have been smoking some strong stuff when he wrote this. Carpenter is one of those few directors that I would call rigorous, by which I mean that you really feel like you're getting something decent to chew on when you watch his films. As with the great directors of his generation, such as De Palma, Scorsese, David Lynch, Walter Hill, and a few others, Carpenter always communicates his almost evangelical passion for the art of cinema, including his respect for the great filmmakers of the past. Guys like this are appropriately called auteurs because you can recognize their signature in their best films, and when you can't find that in one of their films, you know something's wrong. Did Carpenter predict Fox News? The network launched in October of '96. Think about it. Here are Michelle Forbes and Stacy Keach as the United States police force leaders. At the time, I mostly just knew Forbes from Dominic Senna's great 1993 film California with a K. Keach had recently starred in the most memorable segment of Carpenter's Body Bags TV movie, the one about the guy who undertakes an experimental hair growth procedure. Forbes describes a coalition of South American nations unified to attack the United States via LA and Florida. She calls it the revenge of the pre industrialized societies who all want to take back North America. Sounds like a pretty familiar excuse to demonize foreigners. And there's Mr. Peter Jason of Hollywood, rest in peace. He actually just passed away in 2025. He was a favorite actor of both John Carpenter and Walter Hill, and he acted in a total of 7 films for Carpenter and 9 for Hill. You can hear him in a pretty fun commentary track with Carpenter on the DVD of Prince of Darkness. Jason tells the story about his first feature film role working for the legendary Howard Hawks, Carpenter's hero, on the 1970 film Rio Lobo. He dies in front of John Wayne, who tells him, "Well, your neck's broke, kid." A moment ago, we saw Police Channel reporters dutifully admiring the great work that the U.S. police force is doing in cramming all these undesirables into a detention center pending deportation. The government's not completely heartless, though. They do give you the option to be executed on the spot. Not many choices on methods of execution, though. It looks like it's pretty much just the electric chair. They do need to conserve ammunition, you know. Jason explains that part of throwing out the trash, as he puts it, includes deporting not just illegal aliens, but any undesirables at all, including prostitutes, atheists, and runaways, people convicted of moral crimes. And yet, you can see about a third of these prisoners are young children tagging along with their parents. That's the problem with wanton embrace of draconian policies. They get politicians the votes they need, but they also end up victimizing a lot more people than they protect. Kurt Russell returning to play eye-patched anti-hero Snake Plissken is the linchpin of this entire film. Carpenter wouldn't have made it without him, and vice versa. What kind of punishment is it to send Snake to LA? Seems like it would just barely inconvenience him. By the way, if you think that this Dickensian-looking boy in the cap looks a little familiar, you're not crazy. He's a very successful actor nowadays. That's Wyatt Russell, the son of Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn. As in the original film, we see that Pliskin is blissfully unaware of what's going on in the world, believing as he does that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Pliskin is almost exactly the same character as Napoleon Wilson in Assault on Precinct 13, a highly skilled, world-weary, and yet good-hearted mercenary whose rejection of control by corrupt authority has led him into life as an outlaw. Carpenter initially wrote Escape from New York in 1974, and I have to wonder if he redirected many of his ideas for his protagonist into Precinct 13 when that film went into production several years before Escape. The two films could easily exist in the same universe. The world portrayed in Precinct 13 is seemingly on the verge of takeover by crime and gangs. Wilson and Pliskin could be brothers if they're not in fact the same person. Incidentally, Frank Doubleday, who played the spiky-haired punk Romero in Escape from New York, had also played the White Warlord in Assault on Precinct 13, himself a Michael Myers prototype, an emotionless killing machine impervious to pain. Here we start getting clued into all the futuristic technology that's so important to the plot, and I'm making air quotes around the word futuristic. All this business about mini discs and keypad devices and holograms and virtual reality are kind of old fashioned, even for the late 90s, as is the stuff coming up with the satellite weapons. It's an awful lot of MacGuffin material to cram into such a compact movie, and it's probably not necessary. But Carpenter wasn't trying to be cutting edge in terms of information technology. The real way in which this film had its finger on the pulse of American culture is its portrayal of a supposedly democratic society lunging towards theocracy and becoming a police state. It can happen faster than you think, right under your nose. There's also a little matter of a flu-like designer virus that's used to control people and is generally understood by the underworld, at least, to be a government hoax. Don't get up in arms, folks. This is strictly science fiction we're talking about. This is a great image. A spoiled white teenager in a Jackie O Chanel-like outfit, whatever this is, ranting deliriously about capitalist corruption. This war between extremist political positions is getting more to the core of Carpenter's interest. He's going to demonstrate in this film how the far left and the far right are really united in their corruption and hypocrisy, and in their urge to control society. For those who weren't around in the 90s, people were really obsessed with virtual reality, and its visualizations in tons of movies and TV shows were ubiquitous and pretty ugly, too. It was supposedly the next big thing and was going to basically replace much of the real world, including movies for sure. It's really just a gimmick like 3D and the metaverse and AI that keeps popping up every few years but never takes over like it always threatens to. Here, the revolutionary cult messaging coming through these VR projections puts Carpenter's agenda front and center, which is to critique our contemporary society and its dual addictions to technology and fanaticism. As in New York 15 years prior, Snake, the notorious mercenary, is being manipulated into doing an extraction job that the government can't manage on its own. Snake is unimpressed by these black-clad officials trying to intimidate him. I'd like to think that he's cynical enough to not believe anything they say, but as soon as he feels the effects of the virus in his system, he has no choice but to go along. When the scenario is presented to him, he says, "Sounds familiar," which is Carpenter's way of acknowledging to the audience that he's not trying to fool anyone. This is indeed a restaging of Escape from New York, not a retread, but a reuse of the same template to achieve somewhat different goals. It's significant that Snake comments on the president's lack of concern for his own daughter's well-being, too. There's a theory that all cynics are really just disappointed idealists. Snake's wisecrack betrays his inner idealist. He really does hope for a leader who has some sense of honor. I love the hyperbole she uses to describe this designer virus. She calls it 100% pure death. Wow, that's more like a tagline for an action movie. The casting of Cliff Robertson as this fanatical yet cowardly president is pretty interesting. He had played John F. Kennedy in the film PT-109, and in a great movie called The Best Man, written by Gore Vidal, he played a rabid right-wing candidate running for president, a character strongly based on Richard Nixon. Carpenter's script for Escape from New York was written largely in reaction to the Nixon administration in the early 70s, especially the idea of an ambiguous foreign war used as a distraction from the flagrant corruption and decay in our own country, and as an excuse to chip away at our civil liberties. You can see we're still going way overboard with all the gadgetry. Surely it was enough to just tell Snake that he's been infected with the Plutoxin 7 virus. We didn't really need to see it visually confirmed with that touchpad thing, the countdown clock, and even the little flashback showing the needle that that woman used to prick his hand. Why all the overkill? Carpenter isn't someone known for going overboard with exposition, so the only way I can interpret this is as his way of satirizing the over reliance on technology that characterizes our society. It always kind of cracks me up, not only that the president attends this meeting in person, but that he and his staff seem to have so much time to waste to spend trying to pressure Snake into doing this mission than he'd done, and explaining why, and staging this elaborate ruse using the hologram device. They would have felt pretty dumb if Snake had never tried to lunge at them. I don't know if he really needed all the details about Cuervo, Utopia, and the Doomsday device. They could have just said, look, man, you got to get that case back within 8 hours or we're all dead, including you. The only info that would be helpful is if they actually knew where Utopia and Cuervo were, but they don't. So why not just let him be on his way? And not only this, but then they go from that scene with the president to another room where everyone takes their time choosing gear for Snake to take with him. Really? This gearing up scene just continues the parody of gizmo fetishism as you find in the James Bond films. I mean, we're almost more in Batman territory here. If you remember all the hilariously labeled objects that could emerge from Adam West's Bat utility belt, like the Batarang and the Bazooka. Well, Snake will actually find a use for all this stuff along the way, even the stick matches. Why is it so important to Malloy that Snake lose even more time changing into a whole new outfit? Does he know that Snake will need a fireproof coat within the next few hours? Did he read the script? It seems the writers just wanted Kurt Russell in a cool getup for the rest of the movie. But why? Everything else is just like Escape from New York, so why couldn't Snake keep his snazzy camouflage pants? Well, it is an excuse to show off his conversation piece, the cobra tattoo on his abdomen, whose tail I'm sure just coils around his thigh or something. You'll notice that Carpenter's music theme for Snake's character is very Western themed and even bluesy. It has a kind of Ry Cooder vibe to it, the guy who scored many of Walter Hill's films. Carpenter's score for his next film, Vampires, will be made up almost entirely of this kind of Western blues style. This all black leather outfit, especially the trench coat, really placed this film in the 90s aesthetic. I was never much of a fan of it, but it was certainly huge at the time. If you think of The Crow, Blade, The Matrix, it's really part of this anticipation of the 21st century, but it's just kind of fanboy stuff that died out pretty quick. You saw it lingering in stuff like Equilibrium and the Underworld movies, but once the superhero craze took over, this conspicuously ultra cool, gravity defying, black clad ninja type character sort of faded away fast, which I was fine with since it's so lame. This is one of the greatest gags in the whole movie, by the way, as Snake takes a brief second to acknowledge that Michelle Forbes is actually a woman underneath that head to toe black uniform. And why not? He's about to be kicked out of the world, might as well take a last good look around. After all, he has no idea at this point that he'll be bumping into Valeria Golino and Pam Grier a little later. Critics in 1996 mainly fixated on the fact that Escape from LA is more or less a scene for scene remake of Escape from New York rather than a real sequel. They never really explained why that's a bad thing, but just embraced the implication that it must mean that Carpenter was out of ideas or desperately and cynically trying to revive one of his past successes. According to that logic, Martin Scorsese shouldn't have made Casino because it was too much like Goodfellas, and David Lynch shouldn't have made Twin Peaks because it was too much like Blue Velvet. Newsflash, all the great directors are always, in a sense, making the same film throughout their lives because they have certain interests and ideas and perspectives that they're trying to refine or just enjoy exploring. In other words, whenever someone complains that a director is doing the same thing over and over again, number one, that doesn't turn me off to the films. And number two, it just tells me that the speaker doesn't really understand cinema. This film might share the skeletal structure of Escape from New York, but what's interesting about it, and the reason Carpenter made it, is how different it is in appearance and tone. New York has satirical aspects, but is also overwhelmingly bleak. Its humor is as dark as its cinematography. LA, in contrast, recasts the same basic concepts in a different sensibility and a completely different color palette. That shift also has a lot to do with Carpenter's change in cinematographers. The legendary Dean Cundey, so essential to the Carpenter image in the 70s and 80s, became way too A-list for Carpenter after Big Trouble in Little China, after which Gary Kibbe became the director's preferred DP. Cundey is probably the superior technician, but to his credit, Kibbe never tried to replicate the look and feel of Cundey's work. His collaborations with Carpenter are characterized by an almost comic book-like color and vividness. Kibbe's a major contributor to the style of Carpenter's later films. He photographed Prince of Darkness, They Live, Body Bags, In the Mouth of Madness, Village of the Damned, Escape from LA, Vampires, and Ghosts of Mars. Did you notice two titles missing from that list? Kibbe skipped the two garbage movies that I don't even like to think about. I'll mention them later, but as a hint, Chevy Chase was in one of them, and Amber Heard in the other. So here we're into one of the big scenes that really gets people's dander up. It's one of the most flagrantly horrendous uses of CGI in the film, the other one being the surfing scene. I feel like 70 or 80% of the venom this film gets is probably generated by this underwater sequence as Snake zips through a submerged area of Los Angeles in a little jet-powered one-man submarine, whatever this thing is. The quality of the effects work is so bad, it's more like something out of a video game. There's no defense for it. I can't believe that this was the only option available to the production, nor that it was really that much cheaper and more time efficient than other methods. Anyway, it is what it is. The one thing I can say in its defense, though, is that this extra phony great white shark that lunges for us here is priceless. It only works because it's not just a fake shark, but it really is a fake shark. It's supposed to be the mechanical shark from the Universal Studios ride that's broken loose and is just floating around free now. So I suppose you could say that the fakeness of the visual effects is comparable to the fakeness of Hollywood and movie making in general, but I wouldn't press that point as a defense. Although there wasn't a ton of urgency before, once Snake is in the sub, he's suddenly in a big hurry and doesn't mind overheating the vehicle. Once on land, he makes a brave attempt to save the craft, although it's not clear if it's even usable at this point. I'm terrible with geography, but I think Snake has a pretty long walk ahead of him, going on foot down Mulholland Drive in the hills all the way into Hollywood. I think it would take at least 4 hours. Well, maybe he hitches a ride part of the way. I love how there's a group of surfers just sitting out in the completely flat water right next to the cliff. I guess maybe they're just having a board meeting. One of these guys is Breckin Meyer, Travis the skater from Clueless. He had some lines that were cut out. He's still in the credits, though, even though you can't really see him. I read that Bo Jesse Christopher is there somewhere too, which really sucks if he was cut out. You may remember him as the young Gromit in Catherine Bigelow's Point Break. Peter Fonda plays a character called Pipeline. He warns Snake about the acid rain that starts coming down. From here on out, it's going to be a regular barrage of jokes about every cliche related to Southern California that you can think of, from the tourist traps to the surfers, the acid rain, the earthquakes, Disneyland, plastic surgery, gangs, and drive-by shootings, and on and on. It's like Carpenter just made a list of things to include to get a smile out of the audience. Fonda, of course, evokes the 60s and the mellow California vibe that Carpenter is satirizing. Although the actor was known for his role as a biker and easy rider rather than as a surfer in any movies. 3 years later, Fonda would be used for basically the same reason in a very different film, Steven Soderbergh's The Limey. Pipeline is also one of many characters in the film who will make reference to Snake being shorter than they expected. That's a twist on the running joke in Escape from New York, in which everyone he meets comments that they thought he was dead. This is a sly way to incorporate the idea of the Western outlaw that appealed to Carpenter. Like a roving 19th century gunslinger, Snake is famous, but in varying ways. Tall tales spread alleging that he's bigger than he really is, has killed more people, has pulled off great feats of strength or cunning, and is a better shot than anyone in the world. The fastest gun in the West, they'd surely call Snake Plissken if he was an outlaw in the Old West. From this point on, the film is only going to catch its breath in very short breaks, and we're going to be on a pretty relentless roller coaster ride as we barrel through one eccentric action sequence after another. Here's one thing the film got wrong: acid rain isn't as bad as it was then. Today would be more like microplastic rain. As Snake passes by the famous Capitol Records building, this is probably a good place to mention the music, because it's the first moment in the film where we can hear music that's not part of Carpenter's score, but is also still non-diegetic. I think the only diegetic song we'll hear is Randy Newman's I Love LA, which is hilariously appropriate and ironic. Unlike most movies that use real songs as part of the score, there's a real unity to them in this film. They're all of the so-called alt metal or progressive metal or industrial subgenres. It's pretty clear that Carpenter didn't just let the studio choose a bunch of pop hits, but was specifically interested in the cutting-edge music of the time. Some of the bands we'll hear include Tool, Sugar Ray, Stabbing Westward, White Zombie, Ministry, and a few others. The major non-metal piece coming up later is going to be a Dick Dale track, and that's primarily because the scene is surfing related. I believe that this film's soundtrack can definitely be seen as a trial run for Ghosts of Mars, where Carpenter will have an all-metal score composed by himself, but played by many of the leading metal artists of the day, like Anthrax and Buckethead. Here's Robert Carradine of the Acting Carradines as the skinhead who hassles Snake. He had been in Carpenter's Body Bags and would go on to appear in Ghosts of Mars as Peter Jason's sidekick train driver. When Snake asks him where he can find Cuervo, he says, "What do I look like, a tour guide?" A little foreshadowing to the fact that Snake's going to hook up with Maps to the Stars Eddie a little later, a full-time tour guide. The society we find in this dystopian LA is considerably more advanced and even livable than New York. It's still dog-eat-dog for sure, but while New York had soulless punks and cannibalistic sewer dwellers, LA is a dark paradise. It has tour guides, parades, lavish parties, and as Taslima will tell us in a little while, a woman can even wear a mink coat if she wants to. It seems that even the real-world Bloods and Crips have been replaced by much more interesting rival gangs, one led by a passionate Latin revolutionary and the other by a fabulous trans diva who lives in the Queen Mary. As Snake explores LA, we get the idea that, unlike the desolate streets of New York, Los Angeles has a raucous and bustling nightlife. Looks like one big party to me, except for all the casual murder. Another big difference between the two films is that Snake's time constriction is significantly shorter now. In New York, he had a little under 24 hours, and now he only has 8 hours from the time he heads into LA. I think that's actually an improvement in the scripting on Carpenter's part because there's a big section of downtime in Escape from New York that doesn't really serve any purpose. There's one brief scene taking place in the day, and then it jumps right to nighttime again, during which we assume that Snake's just been unconscious all day. Seeing all of this production design and hundreds of costumed extras, it hits me again how unfortunate and unfair it is that this movie is so known for the cheapness of its effects. Because you can really see how, at least in all of the live action scenes, the budget is on full display right on the screen. The handful of bad CGI shots really are just a case of a few bad apples spoiling the barrel. We're about to be introduced to the ruler of the Los Angeles underworld, Cuervo Jones, played by the Greek-French actor Georges Corifas. Cuervo Jones, what a name. According to the government, anyway, Jones is not only the head of a cult-like guerrilla force called the Shining Path, but also the leader of a massive street gang called the Mescalito Justice. Although all evidence points to that group being much more of a revolutionary political force, too, than a mere gang. I suppose this group is the logical extension of Street Thunder from Assault on Precinct 13, another so-called street gang that seemed a lot more into violent social upheaval than mere petty crime. The Latino leader of that gang and Cuervo Jones here both wear a beret that's clearly meant to evoke Che Guevara, the charismatic Guatemalan Marxist guerrilla leader whose poster is omnipresent on college dorm room walls. Ironically, as confirmed by Carpenter here, Guevara, decades after his death, is probably more significant as an icon of pop culture than for his ideology or career. Cuervo's counterpart in Escape from New York, the Duke of New York, was content to ride around in a chandelier-covered limo and didn't have much of a constituency, just a bunch of henchmen. Cuervo, in contrast, portrays himself as a man of the people and loves receiving the adoration of LA's population. He's having such a good time, I'm not sure why he wants to leave so badly. I guess he's a true believer. It's kind of interesting and revealing that Cuervo indicates his awareness of Snake Plissken's reputation as soon as he sees him. He doesn't describe Snake as a mercenary or as a bank robber, but simply as a gunfighter. What on earth is a gunfighter in the late 20th and 21st centuries, anyway? The word suggests someone who earns money in quick draw duels, not necessarily a lawman or an outlaw. We're coming up to another classic CGI moment. This one strikes me as even more egregious than either the underwater sequence or the upcoming surfing scene. And the reason is because this is such a great action scene. You can tell all these motorcycles and cars and running horses and guns and explosions are all really there. And then the illusion is obliterated with one shot that shows Snake on his bike, somehow leaping from the road up and onto the bed of a moving truck. It would be such an awesome stunt if they really did it, but nope. Cuervo shows that he's not a weak and sheltered leader here, too, as he jumps right into action to take out Snake himself with his skillful use of the bolas. I just praised Carpenter's writing a moment ago, but here's one of the worst bits of writing in the whole film, as Snake just kind of falls out of his trench coat when he takes a tumble off the motorcycle. Come on, John. It obviously only happens this way because the screenwriter didn't want Snake wearing the coat for the whole movie, not until the instant before he'll need it again to save his life. Snake could have gotten the coat snagged on something, or he could have taken it off himself for this little showdown scene, but oh well. No time to fret over stuff like that if you're going to enjoy this movie. But it does remind me of when Keanu Reeves calmly explains that he just fell out of his suit of armor while falling down the stairs in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But at least it's clearly a joke there. As you probably know, the Western genre is extremely important to Carpenter. It's not that he was merely a fan growing up watching Westerns in the 50s and 60s, when some of the best of all time were being made. Some of the key directors of Westerns were major auteurs whose style helped to shape Carpenter as he was developing his own cinematic vision. John Ford, of course, was the greatest of them all, and Carpenter paid homage to the Searchers several times. He cast Henry Brandon, the actor who played Scar in The Searchers, as one of the cops in Assault on Precinct 13. And Jamie Lee Curtis's character in Halloween, Laurie Strode, is named after Vera Miles' character, Laurie Jorgensen, in The Searchers, as well as the actor Woody Strode, who appeared in many westerns, not The Searchers, but Ford's Sergeant Rutledge and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Though not a director of westerns, Alfred Hitchcock was also extremely influential to Carpenter, as he was to many filmmakers of his generation, like Scorsese, Spielberg, and De Palma. His pair of 1978 films, Halloween and Someone's Watching Me, really allowed Carpenter to show off the depth of his Hitchcockian training. Even more important to Carpenter than Ford or Hitchcock, though, was Howard Hawks. Carpenter's visual style is very different from Hawks, but I think that what he was moved by in Hawks' films was the clarity of form and content. Hawks mastered what is sometimes called the invisible directing style, meaning that it didn't call attention to itself in any way. Hawks wanted his audience to be fully immersed in his film's stories and never be reminded of the director's presence. That, of course, is nothing like Carpenter at all, who is known for his floating, stalking camera work and striking compositions in the 2:35:1 Panavision aspect ratio. Hawks films are also known for their stories about groups of professionals in confined locales, their tough heroines, and intensely close male friendships. After showing clips of Hawks' The Thing from Another World on a TV in Halloween, Carpenter went on to direct The Thing in 1982, widely considered Carpenter's most flawless film and one of the greatest remakes ever. As Pliskin, Kurt Russell is kind of doing his Clint Eastwood impression a bit in these films. This was inspired by the casting of Lee Van Cleef in Escape from New York, who had previously co-starred with Eastwood in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now, this funny-looking guy here is the great Steve Buscemi, the busy fixture of indie movies in the 90s. In 1996 alone, he appeared not only in this film, but in Robert Altman's Kansas City, most famously in the Coen brothers' Fargo, and also Trees Lounge, which he not only acted in, but wrote and directed too. He plays Maps to the Stars Eddie here. Everyone in this film goes by an alias or a nickname. His promotional tape explains that just because LA was destroyed doesn't mean that its glitz and glamour have diminished. Sounds reasonable to me. That Bangkok Rules gunfight a moment ago is a key scene regarding Snake Plissken's character. It's a pretty tired cliche to have action movie heroes be invincible badasses. There's no suspense at all when you see Chuck Norris or Jean-Claude Van Damme heading into a fight. And that's an inherent weakness of action movie storytelling. And it's why non-action fans feel entitled to condemn the whole genre as not serious. What makes the escape movies great is that Snake is a mortal man and has to use his wits, which he does by inventing the so-called Bangkok Rules when he finds himself outnumbered. Faced with a posse of killers who wouldn't hesitate to shoot him for pleasure, he's justified in being cold-blooded out of self-preservation. And although his judgment fails him sometimes, as when he lets his guard down with Eddie later, his instincts are pretty sharp throughout. Snake's about to learn the same lesson Bob Peck did in Jurassic Park, that is, predators are smart enough to trick him with a side attack. Do you think Carpenter meant this as a jab at Jurassic Park? I don't know. More likely he just thought it was a cool idea. After all, Spielberg loved Howard Hawks too, and included a couple shots in Jurassic Park that allude to Hawks' 1962 film Hatari. The cloaked figures who work for the Surgeon General remind me a lot of the vampire zombie guys in The Omega Man, a post-apocalypse movie with Charlton Heston based on Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. How great is it that the Beverly Hills Hotel, one of the major landmarks in LA, has been turned into the headquarters for a guy who has built a fiefdom and power base on the strength of his ability to perform cosmetic surgery. The city being devastated hasn't influenced anyone's priorities. LA is all about vanity and entertainment, and the people retain their passions for plastic surgery and sports, as we'll see. We're looking at some of the grotesque makeup work by the great Rick Baker and his team. Aside from being a hilarious satire on one of the things that Southern California is most known for, plastic surgery, this scene is a great example of real clairvoyance. These horrifying faces just barely qualify as science fiction anymore. There's one lady here who looks exactly like Jocelyn Wildenstein, the rich socialite who went overboard tinkering with her face. Aside from her, just look at Joan Rivers or Mickey Rourke or Axl Rose or Donatella Versace. Whatever you do, don't Google pictures of Donatella Versace. So yeah, this scene is hardly even an exaggeration at this point. All the over-the-top characters get such great entrances in this film. Here is none other than the Surgeon General of Beverly Hills, played by none other than the great Bruce Campbell. This film is really stocked up and down with great cult actors. This is a minor issue that I want to address. It's become a little trendy to rip this scene as a waste of Bruce Campbell's talent. He's such a dynamic actor, of course, and he doesn't do an awful lot here. And if he is doing something with his facial expressions, they're mostly obscured by this heavy makeup. I do get all that, but you know what? It's still Bruce Campbell. He doesn't need to put on a big show to be interesting. Just him being there makes the scene more interesting. I also guess that he may have been cast because his facial features were so famous and part of his persona. After all, he did title his autobiography, If Chins Could Kill, Confessions of a B-Movie Actor. Anyway, I suppose this qualifies as stunt casting to agree, but I say so what? There's no harm done. I mean, what masterpieces were Campbell kept out of because he came and did this fun little part for John Carpenter? I think it's great. Here again is some of Carpenter's awesome screenwriting. Snake is such an agile marksman that he just knows where to hit the doctor with this little mouth dart, which he's never used before, we have to assume, so that the man, while he's collapsing to the floor, will cut Snake's ropes with the scalpel that he's clutching. Absolutely amazing. Not even James Bond ever pulled off a move quite this skillful. I love the implications of this whole concept, too. Or we're to assume, I guess, that whoever is considered the wealthy and famous in this new LA prison society insists on holding on to one of the great symbols of social class in the old society, plastic surgery, something usually regarded as a luxury of the idle rich. And since all the real plastic surgeons either died in the big earthquake or got out of LA before it was turned into a prison, this quack is left behind to take over and name himself Surgeon General. It looks like he's probably not even a real doctor at all, doesn't know what he's doing, and people line up to get mutilated by him anyway. It would have been kind of cool if Bruce Campbell had chased after Snake so we could get him a little more screen time, but that's okay. For such a fast paced movie, we do get a handful of quiet moments where Snake is able to stop for a second and collect his thoughts. There was a great little scene earlier, just before he hooked up with Eddie, where he pulls up a chair and sits to ponder for a minute. It's really a nice detail showing that the character isn't really like Bond at all and doesn't always know exactly what to do and can keep barreling forward without thinking. Despite the ticking time clock, Snake still is smart enough to know that he just needs to sit and think for a few seconds and catch his breath. He did the exact same thing in Escape from New York, too. The scene with Valeria Golino has a direct counterpart in the earlier film as well, though in a different place. The scene in the chock full of nuts shop with Susan Hubley, Kurt Russell's real-life wife at the time. Even though they're basically the same scenes in both films, they serve a pretty important function, and that is to show that Snake may be hard-edged and a loner at heart, but he is ultimately a human being with some degree of compassion and even warmth. He does make effort to help both women, even though he's forced to flee both times, too. Teslima gives voice to some of the film's themes here, meaning Carpenter's own politics. In film school, they never shut up about show, don't tell. But when you're John Carpenter, you can do whatever you want. It is kind of odd, though, because he isn't really known for going overboard on exposition. I mean, you learn almost nothing about the gangs in Assault on Precinct 13 or Michael Myers in Halloween, and that's part of what makes them so scary. Here, though, he really wants to demonstrate that even in an unregulated prison created by a totalitarian regime, the human spirit can't be broken. The world outside LA is the real prison, Teslima explains. By segregating all of the undesirables into one locale, the government inadvertently created the last free zone. This is such a Howard Hawksian moment as Snake mutters, "The future is right now," while handing Teslima a gun and parting. They both know that their ship's passing in the night, and in a better time and place, they could share something more substantial, but even this tiny bit of connection between them does have meaning. So, Carpenter's 90s films are controversial. I think they're a strong group of films and surprisingly diverse in terms of their content and tones, but they're usually regarded as a step down in quality from his more famous 80s films. I would argue that some of those were not held in great regard at the time at all. Not only The Thing, but Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness, and They Live all really found their audiences over time. So while Carpenter's 90s films have been regularly attacked, if you pay attention to what fans say, you can see they're getting more and more confident about always having really liked a lot of these films and never understanding all the hate. There are a lot of things I miss about film culture in the 20th century, but one of the great things about the current era is that the tyranny of professional film criticism has really been overthrown. I don't know anyone who consults newspaper columnists or even TV critics before deciding if they want to watch a film. If anything, they may look to their favorite YouTubers for reviews, but for the most part, people just feel free to watch whatever they're interested in, which is how it should be. The freedom that Taslima savors so much comes with a cost: danger, chaos, and random violence. She's the only doomed character who is given a little dignity at the moment of her death, though. She's only been with us a few minutes, but her death can't easily be laughed off like some of the others in the film. Snake even mourns her briefly in his own way. There's a curious sense of acceptance in her, too, as if she'd rather die free than a slave. There are sources that say Ghosts of Mars was originally developed as a third Snake Plissken film, but as far as I can tell, that's just a rumor that developed a life of its own. It's easy to see how. The Desolation Williams character in that film is exactly the ethical outlaw archetype that matches Napoleon Wilson and Snake Plissken. Carpenter had mentioned a possible third film at one time, but Ghosts of Mars was planned all along as a new film and not something that Kurt Russell was ever going to appear in. Eddie's back, always seeming to know the right place to be. He does have all the maps, after all. He's still ranting about show business for some reason, claiming to be Cuervo's agent, seeing no distinction between politics and entertainment. Fame is fame, and any kind of celebrity can be monetized. When I started this commentary, I told myself I wasn't going to get caught up in identifying all the vehicles, but this one really can't be ignored, can it? Eddie is driving a 1959 Series 62 Cadillac. It's kind of rough to see the abuse it's going to go through later, so I would say enjoy it while you can. It's been equipped with a stun gun in the glove box, and this editing technique of flashing in and out of black and white shots, accompanied by the thunderclap sound effect, really dates this movie more than anything else in it. The effect was so trendy in the 90s and super annoying. I'm a little surprised Carpenter went along with it, but it's over pretty fast, so no real harm done. Snake wakes up cuffed to a treadmill in, well, where are we? I guess we're to assume this is a room in the LA Coliseum, but it's sort of weird that there was no establishing shot to show Cuervo's lair. I would have pictured him inhabiting City Hall or maybe the Bradbury Building would be a lot cooler. We kind of get the impression that Cuervo is just always on the run and not headquartered anywhere in particular, which is fine too. Here we get a ton more exposition about how the satellite weapon system works. That's Leland Orser, who ironically was in Independence Day in 96 too, which I mentioned earlier. He's probably most famous for being in David Fincher's Seven the year before. Who in the world is he talking to, by the way? We don't even see anyone listening to him. I think this speech is strictly for the audience. I kind of wish they didn't bother explaining this stuff so much because the sort of Damocles weapon doesn't make a whole lot of sense anyway. For example, in Escape from New York, it's great that you never find out what's so important on that audio tape the president needs to play for the world. What I don't get about this doomsday device is why its effects are permanent. Sure, an electromagnetic pulse could shut down machinery and technology in the targeted areas, but why can't people just get them going again with some sort of natural power source? Also, is there really no failsafe at all? Can't the government dismantle or reprogram the weapon system without that one little doohickey that Cuervo got his hands on? Speaking of the aiming device, I'm not sure I get why Cuervo can't just pinpoint the space lasers at the police facility that's on the border of LA. Then he could just take his time getting out on a boat or Hershey's hang gliders or whatever, and no one could stop him. Why does he need a government chopper to come get him? Oh, well, I guess maybe he wants the chopper so he can get to the front lines of the war faster. Either that, or it's because we wouldn't have the final act of this movie if the military isn't still active and a force that Snake has to outmaneuver. I don't know if they've got Snake on a treadmill to generate power or if they're just trying to keep him uncomfortable. I'd sure love to have Cuervo's IT guy, the guy who just got reamed out for talking down to his boss. Not only does he immediately know how the top secret government weapons system works, but he's also figured out how to take over the country's TV signals to broadcast everywhere at once. And the president's people can't even block him. That's what happens when you stock your cabinet with friends and sycophants. You eventually realize no one knows what they're doing. It's a brain drain, I think. I'll bet all the smartest people in the country were deported for something deemed a moral crime. Escape from LA falls into the category of films that critics, professional and amateur alike, love to single out occasionally to quench their bloodlust. It's fun and easy to trash a film, but also incredibly lazy. And these types of critics are also inherently cowardly because they tend to jump on the bandwagon to express the exact same opinion as everyone else because they feel safe that way. In any case, I don't feel much obligation to take any of them seriously. I do believe that you should just watch whatever interests you, regardless of what anyone else says about it. As we all know, there are dozens of examples of movies that were collectively bashed when they were released, but went on to become thought of as classics. I won't go into them all, but if you want to just focus on Carpenter's career, think about The Thing. The way it and Carpenter were treated by the press was really scandalous, and for more significant reasons than just his hurt feelings. It damaged his reputation and made it very hard for him to make the films he wanted to make. Just imagine what he could have done right after The Thing when he was at the height of his artistic powers. Christine and Starman are fine, but they're not masterpieces on the level of The Thing. Imagine what he could have done if the Hollywood establishment hadn't completely misunderstood him and then had the nerve to try and wreck his career, too. At this point in the story, the absurdity is just off the charts. The plot parallels between Escape from LA and New York could be understood as a slight commentary on how sequels always need to be pretty much cut from the same cloth as their predecessors, but different enough to at least create the illusion that it's a whole new story. Same but different, as they say. But having Snake forced to fight for his life in an arena for the villain's amusement both times is completely crazy. It really forces you to deal with the fact that Carpenter is not trying to immerse his audience in the film's reality at all, but wants us to actively acknowledge the fact that he's showing us the exact same actions in a different context. Like I said before, I think the only adequate way to deal with this is by directly contrasting the two films and pinpointing what separates them. The story beats are nearly identical, so what's different? It's really the tone, isn't it? In the most basic terms, I'd say that Escape from New York, though it does have humor, is a very grim and desolate quest story, an odyssey taking place in the ruins of what was once the greatest city in the world, the hub of art, culture, and business. And Escape from LA is a colorful, tongue in cheek comic book like relay race across a city that's barely any different after a cataclysm, the epicenter of superficial values and make believe, just as much as it's the epicenter of massive earthquakes and their aftershocks. I like how these guards around the basketball courts look like Nation of Islam members. I love how these guys are all firing directly opposite each other, and yet they managed to only hit the one guy on the court. Must be excellent shots. That's my roundabout way of saying that I believe Carpenter tells us the real purpose of this film by forcing this confrontation between it and Escape from New York. In middle age, Lang, Ford, Hitchcock, and Ozu all remade films that they had directed as young men, but in each case it was primarily because they really thought they could do it better now. And other directors, as I mentioned, continually rework the same basic ideas in film after film due to their own fixations and desires for perfection. But I don't know of another case where a director deliberately remade a film, calling it a sequel, not to do it better or to get something right, but more to say something fairly different about the modern world. It's incorrect, by the way, to suggest that Carpenter revisited Snake Plissken because his career was stagnating and he urgently needed a hit. Escape from New York was successful and popular, but it was hardly a blockbuster. It seems to me that he could easily have jumped back into the Halloween franchise if he really needed some guaranteed box office. The franchise was desperate for him to return and probably would have paid him a small fortune even if the resulting film didn't rake in as much money as hoped for. So, getting back to this issue of whether or not Escape from LA should be identified as more of a sequel or a reimagining or a soft reboot, even though that last term didn't exist at the time, I can't say definitively, but I do feel that it belongs in the very elite category of sequels that were made to, in some way or another, come to terms with the reality of the original film. Some sequels, if they're made by thoughtful filmmakers who have more on their minds than just an easy paycheck, undertake to critique the original films while also continuing their stories, and sometimes they even directly mocked the earlier films. When Francis Ford Coppola made The Godfather Part 2, he was well aware that a lot of the fans just wanted more mafia action where Michael Corleone wipes out all of his enemies. But he was more interested in showing the consequences of mob life and made sure to portray Michael as broken and bitter and alone by the end of that film. In the cases of Russ Meyer's Beyond the Valley of the Dolls and Joe Dante's Gremlins 2, the director's entire approach was to satirize the first films. In other words, tell the same basic story while also sending up all of the gimmicks or cliches that made the first film so popular. James Cameron's Terminator 2 also comes to mind, where he controversially subverted the whole idea of Arnold Schwarzenegger as the unstoppable killing machine by turning him into the loyal protector of John Connor. Now, how does this relate to Escape from LA? I don't think Carpenter necessarily felt a need to redress anything that he was unsatisfied with in Escape from New York. which I consider not only perfect, but the quintessential Carpenter film. Nor do I think he felt a burning desire to continue the adventures of Snake Plissken due to an abundance of fresh story ideas. That's borne out by the fact that he basically reused the same exact plot. I think what changed in the intervening years was one, the prominence of pop culture and postmodernism in the 90s, which was heavily focused on irony and elevating genre fare above the more respectable Oscar bait kind of movies. Two, the political zeitgeist that saw jihadism and economic crises quickly converging. And three, the simple fact that Carpenter, after a decade of frustrations, welcomed the chance to reunite with his favorite actor, Kurt Russell, and his best producer, Deborah Hill, in a sphere that allowed him to express himself both artistically and philosophically. I've been pretty critical about CGI in this movie, so for a change of pace here, I'm going to get even more critical. The scene is a sublime example of the devastation that CGI has brought upon cinema, and I'll tell you why. Kurt Russell practiced forever to be able to run around and shoot these shots over and over, and what we're seeing is real. Even the famous full court throw at the end, he really did. And that's the problem. We're so conditioned to assume that anything extraordinary or even mildly inconvenient in movies from the mid 90s onward was most likely accomplished digitally. How many times have we all had to hear that Tom Cruise really climbed up a building or hung out of an airplane? The problem is, we have to be told outside the context of the film that some things were done for real. And this diminishes the work done by actors, stuntmen, and practical effects artists. Long story short, before CGI, you could watch this scene and cheer when Snake makes that basket in one wide shot, because it could only have been done if Kurt Russell did it on set. After CGI, you see this and you just go, big deal. This town loves a winner, as Eddie reminds us. Here we see that Cuervo, the socialist man of the people, doesn't really feel obligated to abide by the people's wishes at all. He is a dictator, and if he doesn't feel like letting Snake go, he's not going to. And yet another super convenient aftershock has enabled Snake to escape again. Everyone's flooding out of the Coliseum now. I wanted to mention that the perversion of sports in this dystopia matches the perversion of show business. I was a little disappointed that Snake actually gave in and participated in the b-ball death game. I kind of wish he just found a way to escape immediately, which he ends up having to do anyway when Cuervo refuses to let him out. Carpenter got a little flack for depicting people being able to lift up manhole covers with their bare hands in Assault on Precinct 13. So, how did he respond to that in this film 20 years later? He just did it again. At least in Escape from New York, the crazies used hooks or pry bars to pull the covers up. But, oh well, I guess this isn't the most fantastic thing Snake does in this movie. One of the things I really like about this film is that even though it's so tongue-in-cheek and so cartoon-like in a way, it also amazingly has time to give almost all of the characters moments of nuance and reflection. I'm thinking of the Stacy Keach and Peter Fonda characters, Eddie, Hershey, and even Utopia here. They all have brief instances where they reveal their misgivings or ambivalence about the choices they've made. Like they're not entirely sure they're on the right side, but the best they can do is try to adjust as the situation keeps changing. The only two who are irredeemable are the two primary antagonists, the president and Cuervo, who are both zealots but also terrible hypocrites. Utopia says just that herself in this scene, that she's realized Cuervo is exactly like her father. They both just want to control everything. AJ Langer did a ton of TV in the 90s, and she's actually a real aristocrat too. She married some kind of English lord or something like that. I mostly just know her from Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs. And speaking of Craven briefly, he and John Carpenter had a lot in common career-wise. Just a few months after Escape from LA was released in 96, Craven put out Scream. In their own ways, both films were critiques of their makers' reputations as well as the American culture as we headed towards the new millennium. But whereas Carpenter's film failed massively with critics and moviegoers, Scream was, of course, a major hit and a genre game changer that really defined the final stage of Craven's career. Both men had philosophical and esoteric ideas that they were interested in expressing and felt somewhat constrained by being pegged as strictly horror directors. But I think they both came to terms with that eventually and found ways to incorporate their interests in even the most seemingly straightforward horror fare. President Cliff Robertson is reduced to hiding under the table here, praying for help. He'd been put in office thanks to the big earthquake that toppled Los Angeles in the first place, and now he's hoping that another quake will kill off whoever's still left in the city and solve his problems again. I'd love to know how George Corofas got cast in this film, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, by the way, which is a real possibility. He's only done a handful of English language films. I suppose he was cast due to his passing resemblance to Che Guevara, especially with his long hair. I don't know what was in it for him, though, unless maybe he was just looking for an entree into Hollywood films. I mostly know him from a movie called Impromptu that I like a lot. He's a very busy actor, around 70 now, a massive resume of work in film, television, and the stage. He almost seems out of place here amid all these great B movie actors, but I love his performance. He brings a real gravitas and intensity to Cuervo. You can see that he's having a blast, but also that he never condescends to the material or acts like it's beneath him. So Snake has run into the surfer dude again, Pipeline. He's definitely struggling at this point, having not only been shot in the leg, but feeling the effects of the virus he was injected with, too. So he decides to do what most normal people do when they have the flu and an untreated gunshot wound in their leg. He goes surfing. All I can say is this wave must be extremely important to Pipeline because he's willing to just leave behind his Jeep and his quiver of boards. That's pretty extreme. I do wonder if he retrieved the one he lent Snake after Snake jumped off it. Some have complained that Snake doesn't pop up into a standing position like you're supposed to, but I actually love that. The point is that he's not an experienced surfer, so he's struggling a little. Plus, he's got that bullet in his thigh. Anyway, once he's up, he does pretty well. This might be the most famous scene in the film, and unimaginative YouTubers often show a brief shot of Snake on the wave as evidence of how stupid and embarrassing this movie is. That's really just a cheap shot, not because the effects aren't awful, because they are, but it's not like this is a case where Carpenter or anyone else on the production were claiming that this was state of the art work for 1996. But I think the film makes it pretty clear at the outset that it's embracing a level of silliness that you really have to buy into if you're going to enjoy the film at all. And I know a lot of people do enjoy the film for that very reason, not ironically, not as a so bad it's good kind of thing, but because it joyously takes the viewer along on this wild ride and it doesn't fail in any way. It does exactly what it sets out to do. That to me is a sign of success, whether or not the financials or the words of mainstream critics agree. Eddie exclaims, "You gotta be kidding me," when he gets a load of Snake chasing him on a surfboard. That's, of course, a callback to not Escape from New York, but one of the most famous lines in Carpenter's The Thing. The track we're hearing is one of the few pieces that is neither part of Carpenter's score nor one of the many alt metal bands that he put together to augment the soundtrack. This is Scalped by the legendary guitarist Dick Dale, who was in the middle of a major career resurgence at this moment. This actually wasn't a vintage track either. It's from his latest album at the time, from 1994. Some people tend to give all the credit for Dale's newfound popularity to Pulp Fiction, which famously used Dale's classic record Miserlou in its opening credits. I call BS on that a little though because Dale put out his real comeback album Tribal Thunder in 1993. It was well known. I ran out to the record store the first day it was out to get it. Back in ancient times, there were these places called record stores, which were the only places to go to buy new music. Anyway, it was his first album in around 30 years. It had a video for the song Nitro that played on MTV, and Beavis and Butthead even reacted to it favorably. Beavis and Butthead were the original song reaction video makers, by the way. So anyway, I'm not saying Quentin Tarantino needed to be reminded of how great Dick Dale was, but Dale was already coasting a big wave when Pulp Fiction came out. Having said that, I'm certain the studio, maybe even Carpenter too, were more than happy to tap into the Tarantino fad that was so huge at the time. I will mention Tarantino once more in a few minutes. I wonder if you can guess why. One of the great things about a destroyed LA is that there's no traffic anymore. Look how fast they got downtown. And here in the Queen Mary is headquartered one of Cuervo's main rivals for control of the city, the leader of a group called Saigon Shadow. I don't know how many times I saw this movie before I finally realized that they didn't just drive all the way to Long Beach, to where the Queen Mary really is, but apparently the ship actually got moved in the big flood and has ended up right in downtown LA. This is a great location, but it's got to be a pain to get in and out from the ground. Well, maybe they use those hang gliders we'll see shortly to come and go. I love this bouncer guy. Eddie is chattering a mile a minute, and the guy just stares at him in silence. Eddie cannot believe that someone isn't excited to meet Snake Plissken. Now, this gang that's with Hershey is made up of all the greatest stuntmen of the 80s and 90s, at least all the Asian American ones. A few of them acted in Big Trouble in Little China, too. I don't know all their names, but I see Al Leong there, and the great Jeff Amata is going to get a pretty good close up soon. And of course, the queen of the underworld here is none other than the goddess Pam Grier. And as if that's not enough, she plays a transgender woman who was once an old acquaintance of Snake's, a professional criminal named Carjack Malone. You gotta love all these nicknames: Carjack Malone, Texas Mike O'Shea. And how great is it that Snake is so progressive that he barely blinks an eye to find that Carjack is now a woman? If this movie was made in the 80s or earlier, or by anyone other than Carpenter, our hero would certainly react with shock and revulsion and make a lot of lame jokes. Now, speaking of being open minded, I don't know what kind of friendship Snake and Carjack had back in the day, but they both seem to think it's fine for Snake to slowly run his hand up Hershey's leg like this. And he says, "I see you're still packing my gun between your legs." The innuendo here, again, is just kind of a parody of the kind of thing you'd hear in James Bond movies. Pam Grier was a big star in exploitation films in the early 70s. She was in The Big Dollhouse, Foxy Brown, Friday Foster, Sheba Baby, Black Mama, White Mama, and a bunch of others. But the best of them all is Jack Hill's Coffee. That's my favorite, where she says, "This is the end of your rotten life," before blowing a dude's head apart with a shotgun. What's really curious about this character is that it's somewhat clearly a woman's voice, just lowered in post to sound deeper. So it really is Pam Grier's voice you're hearing. I love that, even though it makes no sense. Shouldn't it be the other way around, as in a man trying to sound more like a woman? I read that in foreign markets, they just overdubbed her lines with a male actor, I guess because it was too much of a hassle to try and replicate the effect they did with Greer's voice. So, one thing I always like to point out about Pam Grier's presence in this film is that it does predate her big comeback role in Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown by over a year. Not only that, but she was in not one but three fairly high profile movies in 1996 alone: Larry Cohen's Original Gangstas, Tim Burton's Mars Attacks, and John Carpenter's Escape from LA. Granted, none of these were monster hits, but they were fairly well known, and it was pretty notable in each case and exciting to see Pam Grier in all three of them. So, anyway, yeah, it was huge that Tarantino cast her as the lead in Jackie Brown. But it isn't like he had to scour the earth to find her and then drag her out of retirement. She had been working pretty steadily in very good films for 25 years. I always loved her in the 80s films, Something Wicked This Way Comes, Above the Law, and The Package. I'm not going to comment on her figure, but there's Jeff Amata. Let's just say it makes a lot of sense that her very first film role was in Russ Meyer's Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, even though she's just a background player in it. And the Hollywood Hills are just perpetually on fire. Again, I just have no clue where Carpenter gets these crazy ideas. Greer is one of three actors who would pop up again in Carpenter's Ghosts of Mars 5 years after this, the others being Peter Jason and Robert Carradine. Interestingly, she plays a lesbian character in that film. It seems that for whatever reason, Carpenter was keen to portray her in non heteronormative situations, which is great. Although Greer is certainly not androgynous at all, her persona is larger than life and forceful with a metropolitan quality. So the ways that Carpenter used her are pretty interesting and effective. And this is the funniest joke in the movie, in my opinion. They're all suited up to go hang gliding, and Eddie asks Hershey for some red nail polish, and she just happens to have a bottle on her. I have no idea if the Santa Ana winds could really carry you all the way from downtown LA to Anaheim, but whatever. Like I've said a few times, it's probably not the most improbable thing that happens in this movie. I've never really timed the third act of this movie, but supposedly it plays out more or less in real time from this point forward. Now, this is my favorite shot in the whole film, this majestic crane shot of Cuervo's procession into Disneyland's front gates. Oh, sorry, they call it Happy Kingdom here, not Disneyland. But there's no doubt what this is supposed to be. Anyway, with the music, the camera movement, the production design, this really is one of the peak moments in the film. I'm starting to feel a little bad that I've been so rough on the CGI effects in this film. I do want to clarify that everything else, all the practical work, makeup, sets, costumes, photography, etc., are all top notch. And we should take time to acknowledge some of the key players on this production. I've already mentioned DP Gary Kibbe, of course, and there's also production designer Lawrence Paul, makeup artist Rick Baker, stunt coordinator Jeff Amata, costume designer Robin Michelle Bush, and Shirley Walker co-wrote the score with Carpenter. Are you ready for the new world? Cuervo asks. That's the theme and purpose of this film right there, to ask that question of us, the viewers, the film industry, and maybe even Carpenter himself. Getting a little Black Hawk Down action here as the government chopper lands and is attacked by Cuervo's men. As we cut from the revolutionary announcing the beginning of his jihad, we see the American president fleeing his post because he needs to pray. I'm not sure I get why Malloy seems to be holding the president's hand so much in this story. He obviously doesn't respect the man at all and sees him for the hypocrite and coward that he is, but he also keeps stepping in and almost coaching him on how to be a leader. The president is ready to flee, but Malloy blocks his path and tells him that he needs to face this crisis head on. If the president left, Malloy could handle the situation how he sees fit, but I guess he's probably worried the president will just nuke the whole place from the air. We were earlier informed that the devastating earthquake that flattened LA happened in the year 2000. This notion of the pending end of the world coinciding with the end of the century is not unique to this film. It had been brewing for a long time. I can attest to that personally. I had a religion teacher in my high school years who had it on excellent authority that the second coming of Christ would definitely take place by the year 2000. It was not merely a religious belief that any rational people really held, but the problem was that humanity now had the means to cause massive catastrophes with information technology, machinery, and modern weapons of mass destruction. In other words, it wasn't so much that the hand of God would literally descend to crush civilization, but that fanatics, believing themselves righteous and chosen, could get a hold of man made technology and use it to kill people by the thousands. Yes, you know where I'm going with this. In Escape from New York, one of the most unsettling shots is of Snake's glider flying towards the World Trade Center, which was the tallest building in the world and a major landmark in the city, as well as a symbol of the supremacy of American industrial and economic power. There's a reason Carpenter used it in that film, just as it was used in the 1976 version of King Kong, replacing the Empire State Building from the original film. It was a famous, imposing part of the New York skyline and therefore also, tragically, a huge target. So, in this light and highly entertaining film, Escape from LA, Carpenter showed that he was one of many working artists with an anti authoritarian position who had their ears to the ground in the 80s and 90s and could see where the zeitgeist was pointing. The overwhelming urgency to create better and better technology while also ignoring the rise and fervency of religious extremism could only have had a handful of inevitable outcomes, and none of them indicated peace and prosperity for the new millennium. So, Snake has essentially engineered some conquistador like strategy here, basically capitalizing on the feud between Hershey and Cuervo to get her help in attacking his forces. Although you could see he wasn't 100% convincing when he reassured Hershey that she and her whole crew would be able to escape LA too. This is consistent with Snake Plissken's placement in the tradition of roaming samurai or gunslinger characters that can be traced back through films and literature. One of the foundational works of this kind of story is Dashiell Hammett's 1929 novel Red Harvest, which, along with his Glass Key, was a huge influence on Akira Kurosawa's 1961 film Yojimbo. And that, in turn, cast a long shadow over next generation filmmakers. That film's plot, revolving around a Ronin who pits rival gangs against each other, would be reworked by Sergio Leone in A Fistful of Dollars, by the Coen brothers in Miller's Crossing, and by Walter Hill in Last Man Standing, a 1996 film that came out 1 month after Escape from LA. Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, of course, from the Leone films, was one of the models for Snake's persona. Speaking of Walter Hill, I've always thought of he and John Carpenter as kindred spirits. And I have no idea if they know each other or like each other's films, but it's hard not to notice that they both embraced genre films, especially action and westerns, and brought them into modern scenarios, as Hill did with Streets of Fire and Extreme Prejudice, and Carpenter did with Big Trouble in Little China and They Live. All this stuff is great, not just the pyrotechnics, but this is a pretty good fist fight too. It really feels like Snake and Cuervo are evenly matched and taking a beating. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've taken a significant detour from the strict Escape from New York template that most of the movie has been following. One of the conspicuously missing things from the finale of the original film was a direct face-to-face showdown between Snake and the Duke of New York. They do have a tiny little scuffle and they race each other across the bridge to try and get out of the city, but they never square off mano a mano. I'm not saying that's a flaw, by the way. That film is perfect, but in the post-Schwarzenegger, post-Stallone era, one of the almost mandatory cliches that evolved is having the hero defeat the villain with his own two hands. Before we run out of time here, I want to make sure I say something about how Escape from LA relates to Carpenter's recurring themes of upheaval and revolution. Carpenter is a baby boomer who came of age in the 60s, so it shouldn't be surprising that his sensibility was heavily shaped by a mix of counterculture, politics, irony, rock music, comics, movies, and science fiction. Oh look, Snake got his fireproof coat back just in time for it to save his life in a couple minutes. Anyway, Carpenter has those things in common in diverse ways with several other North American directors of his generation, like David Lynch, Terry Gilliam, John Waters, George Romero, Brian De Palma, Wes Craven, George Lucas, David Cronenberg, etc. All of those guys are about the same age, born in the 40s, and were really transgressive filmmakers. Yes, even Lucas. His films are about escaping the tyranny of bourgeois values and the nuclear family. In Carpenter's films, social turmoil can come from one of three sources: insurgency, nature, and the supernatural. Whether it's the gangs in Assault on Precinct 13, the escaped psychopath in Halloween, or the vengeful ghosts in The Fog, these forces arise in a Lovecraftian way to knock humanity off its pedestal as the rulers of the world. I think it's appropriate that Carpenter's film career culminated with Ghosts of Mars because it mixes all of these themes together in a story about a colonial force coming up against a mysterious ancient life form that has the ability to possess and control human bodies. Whatever you don't like about Cuervo, you can't say he's a coward. He grabs a gun and later a bazooka and heads right to the front line. There's a moment where he gets shot center chest and just laughs like he knows that's a much better story for his legacy, his place in history, that he goes down fighting rather than running. Not cool. I hate that they kill off Hershey and her gang so unceremoniously. Snake could have dropped them off on the other side of the wall like he does for Utopia, or at least they could have gone out fighting. Oh well. I think it's great that Carpenter went all in on portraying this US president as such an overblown, Bible clutching zealot. That's a change from New York, where the president was just more of a buffoonish figurehead. It shows that the major thing that changed in politics between 81 and 96 was the rise of the evangelical movement. Liberals often don't like to remember it this way, but it was really Jimmy Carter who legitimized the born again thing in national politics, not Reagan. After that, though, it never went away. Pat Robertson ran for president in 88, and guys like Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart were all over the news constantly telling you who to vote for. From then on, everyone from Clinton to Bush 2 to Obama to Trump had to put on a big show about their faith and had to announce who their primary spiritual advisors were. Bush literally said that God personally instructed him to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, Al Qaeda thought God had their backs too. So, with stuff like this going on in the real world, I don't think Carpenter was out of line at all in satirizing these people who use religion as an excuse to kill whoever they just happen to feel like killing. Now, there's one more way in which this finale is actually a bit more satisfying than Escape from New York's. If you remember in that film, Snake is basically stranded on the wall while President Donald Pleasance machine guns the Duke. But here, Snake actually uses his wits to outsmart his adversaries. He knows they're desperate and are likely to act irrationally. Malloy is a little more cautious than the president, but even he's not quite as cunning as Snake. I suppose you could complain that Snake couldn't possibly have known that Malloy would capture Utopia and take the decoy device, but I say it's still a great strategy because it doesn't matter. He's two steps ahead already. He has the real disk, which he could destroy or threaten to destroy whenever he wants, and he has the hologram projector. Every few years, there's talk about potential escape sequels and remakes, and I know I'm not alone in being grateful that so far we've been spared that nightmare. Carpenter's Precinct 13, Halloween, and The Fog all got remakes in the 2000s, but thankfully, Escape from New York has been left alone to date. Oh, yeah, that poor Halloween franchise. A dozen movies all made because people are delusional enough to think they can recapture the magic of the first one. And it's never happened, not even close. But money is money, so they'll just keep on making them, I'm sure. As far as Escape from New York and LA goes as a franchise, a prequel might be a lot more interesting than a remake, given all the lore that's always hinted at. Especially in this film, three or four people keep referencing Cleveland and some major kind of crisis that got everyone sent to prison. Might be a good story there. Actually, never mind. Please don't do it, Hollywood. You'll just make a sad mess of it, like everything else. Getting back to the thematic origins of the film, I mentioned Carpenter, but the other part of the equation is Kurt Russell. He was really the driving force in wanting to play Snake again and specifically comment on the state of the world in the 1990s. Two major real world events that influenced the film's story were the LA riots of 1992, which were also the subject of the film Dark Blue that Russell starred in, and the 1994 Northridge earthquake. Both events, in different ways, obviously, were jarring reminders that this modern and complacent society we have is far more fragile than we like to think and could be upended very easily without warning. Incidentally, horror fans may recall the use of earthquakes and aftershocks in Wes Craven's New Nightmare 2, in which Northridge quake damage around LA was shot by Craven and incorporated into the plot. The president's sectarian mania reaches its zenith here as he decides to execute his own daughter on live TV. I love how they're able to put together this makeshift remote studio on a moment's notice. Who says the government isn't efficient? For the longest time, I thought they set up the electric chair out here too, but eventually I realized the soldiers must have taken Utopia back into the facility where the illegal aliens get executed if they don't want to get dumped into LA. It's also interesting that we never see any confirmation about these massive anti American forces that are moments away from invading. I don't think that was done for budgetary reasons because they could have just shown some stock footage on a TV screen or something like that. I don't doubt that it's really happening in the story, but I think the presentation is just ambiguous enough to float the possibility that, like the perpetual fictional wars with Oceania and Eurasia in Orwell, this conflict could be just a smokescreen to keep the population in a state of agitation so they won't object to the government's ongoing abuses of power. The president calling this his final solution might be a little unsubtle, but it's consistent with his character. A man like that, as we've seen in real life, would have no respect for history and would feel perfectly fine using provocative phrases for some cheap, temporary PR purposes. And what a great instant takedown of such pomposity and evil. Eddie's disc, marked with Hershey's red nail polish, plays and makes a complete fool of the president on his worldwide broadcast. It's exactly the same joke as when we hear Cabby's American Bandstand music at the end of Escape from New York, and exactly the same effect. To pull such a brutally ironic and hilarious prank on two US presidents, I say qualifies Snake Plissken as the greatest fictional hero. It's pure yippee political theater and pure punk. And we see that Malloy might have some genuine admiration and even affection for Snake, but he's a true soldier, and that's not enough to make him disobey an order from the president. And this leads to the little capper on Snake's trick, the fact that he's remembered the hologram device they gave him earlier after taunting him with it. As in the first film, Snake makes it clear that there's no way for authority figures to get on his good side. If they call him Pliskin, he says to call him Snake. So then they call him Snake, and he insists that his name is Pliskin. Now that they've lost the upper hand, Malloy and the president warn and plead with Snake to not use the device. But guess what? He's not extremely sympathetic. It's kind of hilarious how completely incompetent this puritanical government is. It makes you wonder how they even got this far and held on to power for so long. Sometimes I think the story might have been a little more tense if the final battle included not only Cuervo's little army and Hershey's band and Snake all fighting, but the government troops charging in too and trying to subdue everyone. But like I said, I guess it complements Carpenter's theme this way with the regime and the military so impotent the whole time. I definitely need to say a few words about the late Deborah Hill, the co producer and co author of this film. This was her first time producing a Carpenter film since Escape from New York, although they did co produce Halloween 2 and 3. Hill is really one of the heroes and major players of Carpenter's early career. They met on Assault on Precinct 13. It's known that she wrote a lot of the girls' conversations in Halloween, which gave those scenes some human warmth and verisimilitude. And she went on to co write and produce The Fog with Carpenter and Escape from New York, of course. After they parted ways, she went on to produce a lot of other great films too, including David Cronenberg's The Dead Zone and Terry Gilliam's The Fisher King. Anyway, rest in peace, Deborah Hill, one of the great producers who succeeded because she loved movies and believed in filmmakers, and was not just a robot executive trying to milk others' talent for as much financial return as possible. Now, we're not meant to analyze the real consequences of Snake's actions, assuming that the Sword of Damocles effect is really as devastating as everyone says. And it's possible that it's not either. Earlier, Hershey claimed that the Doomsday Weapon is just as much a government hoax as the Plutoxin 7 virus, so who knows? Anyway, the story is a parable about sticking it to the corrupt and powerful. Snake's not the kind of guy who thinks about hospital patients on life support or passengers on planes and trains who presumably are plummeting to their deaths at this very moment. Or, more importantly, innocent guys like you and I just trying to watch a movie at home and having the power go out. That would suck. And then he even finds a use for the box of matches he received at the beginning of the film. And then, proving again his true character, he says farewell with a glance into the camera and a soft salutation, welcome to the human race. Not a middle finger or a big FU, but a quiet welcome to the new world. So, as White Zombie plays us out, I want to wrap up with a few words about this film in the context of John Carpenter's 90s work, by which I basically mean In the Mouth of Madness, Village of the Damned, Escape from LA, Vampires, and concluding with Ghosts of Mars, which was released at the end of August in 2001. Carpenter essentially retired at that point, at least from directing. He did make a couple of TV episodes and a thing called The Ward, but I don't really rank those among his filmography. The Masters of Horror shows are interesting without being substantial, and The Ward is completely unrecognizable as Carpenter's endeavor, and I mean that literally. I think if you cut the credits off, you would have no hint that Carpenter was involved. The only other Carpenter film that is in that lowest category is Memoirs of an Invisible Man, a film I really hate and hope to never see again. Everything else, though, even including Dark Star and his TV films like Someone's Watching Me and Elvis, and his less loved works like Escape from LA and Ghost of Mars, are absolutely valid and worthwhile and completely relevant to Carpenter's cinema. The stories that Carpenter chooses to tell are part of the equation, but the other part is his artistic vision. Very, very few filmmakers have ever demonstrated such mastery of the 235-to-1 aspect ratio. The only people I can put in the same class as Carpenter in that regard would be David Lean, Sergio Leone, and maybe John Frankenheimer, just in the film Grand Prix. I would say De Palma and Spielberg too, but even they only used that aspect ratio some of the time. They didn't devote their entire careers to it. One of the things Carpenter is most known for, aside from his music scores, is his commitment to mastering the Panavision frame. There is a deliberate kind of artificiality to not just the color, but the effects in Carpenter's 90s films. This is not a mistake, though, but part of the design of the films. It's not a case of the stitches showing, but part of the tapestry that's meant to be admired. I think you can compare it to the late period work of some of Carpenter's favorite directors, like John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock. If you look at Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance or Hitchcock's The Birds, or even Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo, you see fairly obvious studio sets and backdrops, and they just give off a stage bound feeling. Now, all three of those men were at the top of their game and were certainly capable of ensuring that any self referential elements would not appear in their films. But my theory personally is that they were possibly reacting to the then current rise of the European New Wave, which was all about facing the artifice of cinema directly. I think Carpenter did the same thing, based on the fact that his refusal to conform to contemporary methods had the effect of making his films seem more and more old fashioned in their design. Even when you get to Ghosts of Mars, for example, his last real film, its bold Rashomon like story structure didn't help it be seen as rigorous or intriguing, and it was regarded as kind of a goofball throwaway film. My position, though, is that this demonstrates the weakness of the critics, not Carpenter. In the future, I'm sure that all of Carpenter's films from 1976 to 2001, excluding only that one travesty that Chevy Chase starred in, will be regarded as a cohesive body of work and not be divided up into the so-called good films of the 70s and 80s and the misfires from the 90s. This has been Michael Greenwood. Thanks for listening.